Well, now to the realisation of another long-held dream. The first direct train to Darwin rolled out of Adelaide this morning, nearly a century after the construction of a railway link between the two cities was first promised. The 1,420 kilometres of line from Alice Springs to the north was finished last year, ahead of schedule and under budget. Nonetheless, taxpayers have footed more than a third of the cost, which runs to well over $1 billion. But is it money well spent? This report from Murray McLaughlin in Darwin.
With good reason, this railway has been described as one of Australia's great infrastructure projects, second only to the Snowy River scheme.
This morning in Adelaide was a time for superlatives as the first train left for Darwin. Even the man from Houston, Texas, who heads the consortium which built the new railway line between Alice Springs and Darwin, seemed impressed about the dimensions of the job.
With clever engineering and efficient construction, we built the 93 bridges along the line at an average of one per week and brought the project in 5 months ahead of schedule.
The vision of a railway line to Darwin goes back to the late 19th century.
And the safety barber with me lads to chop the mulga down, to cut the poles and dig the holes from sun up till sundown.
The construction of the overland telegraph line from Adelaide to Darwin in the 1870s fueled the idea of a parallel railway from the Southern Ocean to the Arafura Sea. It coincided with the great age of rail.
Territory at that stage was under the control of South Australia, and they had really three objectives in the line. One was to service the mining areas down near Pine Creek. The second one was to show the world that they were serious about developing the territory. And the third one was to be part of the great North-South Transcontinental Railway that they dreamed of.
The dream developed in fits and starts. There were trains running in the top end by the late 1880s, when this little engine was used to pull people and freight south from Darwin. The line eventually extended 800 kilometres south to Larimer and was a valuable link to Darwin for Australian Defence Forces after Darwin was bombed by the Japanese in 1942. Jim Harvey did war service in the top end and has written the definitive history of the North Australia Railway.
Well, it had to bring up supplies which came up by road from Alice Springs up to Camps North. It had to bring supplies, mainly bulk supplies, which arrived by ship in Darwin, you know, fuel and coal and big ammunition, that sort of thing.
But the line from Darwin to Larimer fell into disrepair after the war. The last train on the old North Australia Railway ran in 1976. The federal government maintained and improved the old line between Adelaide and Alice Springs, and in 1980 a new standard gauge to Alice Springs was completed. But it was not till today that a government promise from early last century to complete the remaining 1,420 kilometres to Darwin was fulfilled. The promise was written into legislation when the Commonwealth took over the Northern Territory from South Australia in 1911.
Our federal government, after 100 years of dithering by others, has put up $191 million to make this railway possible.
The Commonwealth reneged many times, and it was not till the Howard government agreed in 1997 to part-fund the project that the Jeremiahs were overridden. Even then, the commitment had opponents in Cabinet.
30 years' time we'll know all, but there's always vigorous debate in Cabinet. I remember that one particularly well, but I'm just delighted. The outcome is there. The Federation Fund came to the party as a seed catalyst which helped build the momentum.
All together now.
The first sod for the new line was turned at Alice Springs in July 2001. But the start of construction was no blessing for the politicians who had finally brought it about. This was the last time that Prime Minister Howard rubbed shoulders in public with the Conservative leaders of South Australia and the Northern Territory. Chief Minister Dennis Burke was rejected by Territory voters the next month, and the Liberal Party was voted out of government in South Australia in February 2002. Today in Adelaide, the Howard government was concerned that the new Territory and state Labor leaders did not get all the limelight.
I want to particularly congratulate Dean Brown, John Olsen and Shane Stone for persuading Prime Minister John Howard to get behind this nationally important infrastructure project.
The dimensions of the project, completed 5 months ahead of schedule, are eye-glazing. A total of 15 million cubic metres of earthworks, more than 2 million concrete sleepers. 2 track-laying crews laid more than 3,000 sleepers and 2 kilometres of rail each day. 146,000 tonnes of rail were moved first by train to Alice Springs and then by road to be welded into long sections at Plants and Catherine and Tennant Creek. The long sections were laid and welded into a continuous track.
We believe in this railway's great potential for Australia.
This morning's farewell of the first train was a gathering for the true believers. But the substantial investment by Commonwealth, South Australia and Northern Territory governments has its sceptics.
They've spent $2 billion building a railway for 5 trains a week and a few cartons of beer. And I've described the financial returns on that as being smaller than a tick's testicles.
Road transport operators who stand to lose business to the new railway to Darwin are nowhere as scathing as Chris Corrigan, even though trucking jobs will be lost or relocated. The Australian Trucking Association says the competition will be welcome as long as it's fair.
We don't have the fine figures and detail. We appreciate that it's a very significant capital expenditure, and based on that capital expenditure you're looking at volume requirement to make sure that you get a return on it.
Freightlink is the company which will operate the line from Darwin to Adelaide and return. At first it expects to carry 350,000 tonnes of freight a year, but it'll need more than twice that tonnage to be profitable. The company concedes it'll take several years to reach profitability, but is determined to stick to its schedule of 5 trains a week.
Of course you can shorten trains, you can reduce your costs in that way, but we expect that really it will be about increasing trains, train sets and also schedules.
This inaugural train will arrive at Darwin Saturday lunchtime to a reception even more rousing than today's departure ceremony. The journey will be a few hours longer than the regular 46 hours because there'll be welcoming parties along the way at Alice Springs, Tennant Creek and Catherine.
And we should point out, while freight services are now underway, the first passenger train won't arrive in Darwin until February the 3rd. Murray McLaughlin with that report from Darwin.